for tuning into Horror as a Social Platform, brought to you by the Multiverse 2020 Horror Track. The real brief explanation of the panel is social commentary in the horror genre. And I'm going to do very quick introductions of each of our panelists, but if you want more information, just click on the linked videos in the description of this panel. And you can find the links to everyone in this panel and everyone who will be attending the virtual multiverse this weekend. And I guess I'll just have them sort of wave and smile as their names are called. For guest of honor at Multiverse, Maurice Broaddus, author of the Knights of Breton Court trilogy. Michelle Renee Lane, author of Invisible Chains. Marc Abbott, author of Hell at the Way Station. And Peter Salomon, author of 8 minutes, 32 seconds. And again, you can get full information, introduction videos by clicking on the appropriate links. Also, if you're watching this panel as part of the actual convention weekend, you can join us live on the Discord channel as some of the panelists will be discussing it live. And you just go to multiversecon.org/Discord and you can engage with us live as we revisit this amazing panel. Also, we're collecting for charity at ko-fi.com/multiversecon. All donation minus fees go to support the Equal Justice Initiative. And finally, if you want some multiverse swag, check out our store on the website. We have shirts, enamel pins, and more. All right, so that is the introductory stuff. And this is Horror as a Social Platform. All right. My first question for the panelists is, how have you used social commentary in your work? And feel free to go with shameless plugs. Be very specific about your own work. This is the part where you get to say, here's what I've done, here's what you should buy. So yeah, how have you used social commentary in your own work? What issues have you tackled? How have you approached it? And we will start with guest of honor, Maurice.
Alrighty. Well, frankly, social commentary is just part of what I do. So it doesn't matter what genre I'm writing. Most of my stories involve social commentary of one form or another. When I think of my horror work in particular, I say I came up as a horror writer, and so I think the bulk of my horror stories, I like to say I wrote from a place of rage, frankly. It's I look at the world around me and I'm trying to figure out, why things are the way they are, and trying to make sense of, all the evil and injustice I see in the world. So for example, if you pick up my short story collection, Voices of Martyrs, actually 4 stories spring to mind right away. Rite of Passage, which involves a horror story involving the slave trade. A soldier story, which involves a vampire witnessing a lynching. Shadow boxing, which is it takes place in the 1920s, a boxer on the Chitlin circuit. It's a story about internalized self-hatred due to racism. And The Av, which is a story about over-incarceration. Writing becomes a way for me to process my feelings, and it also becomes a way for me to try to make sense of the world around me. So yeah, so I will do social commentary in all the things that I do.
Yeah, so we're seeing that you are an excellent choice for this panel.
And even with the Knights of Breton Courts, that was based. I mean, yes, it's a retelling of the Arthurian legends set in Indianapolis, but it's also a metaphor for homelessness. Magic becomes the metaphor for homelessness. So I get to comment on the state of homelessness. In fact, the whole story is told through the eyes of homeless teenagers. So, and it's a way for me to just even look at my own city and go, you know what, this city looks differently when you look at it through the eyes of homeless teens. So, all right, I'll stop now.
All right, Michelle, what social commentary do you do in your own work?
So most of my stuff is written from the perspective of women of color and the intersectionalities that they encounter in everyday life. But my novel, Invisible Chains, is a slave narrative, and it's told from the perspective of a young female slave. And I wrote it, interestingly enough, several years ago during the Obama administration. And a lot of people asked me why I would be writing a slave narrative when there was this concept of, I guess, a post-racial society. People believed that we were living in one, and that was not what I was seeing. I saw a lot of people upset about having a Black president, and I felt that people were getting bolder about their racism. And I felt like writing a slave narrative at a time when we were all supposed to be feeling safe just made sense to me. And, you know, like Maurice, I write about my own experience through horror fiction as a way of understanding myself and where I belong in the world. It's a better way of seeing the things around me that frighten me on a day-to-day basis, and it's easier to talk about them through horror fiction by writing about monsters.
All right, Marc, what social commentary do you include in your own work?
So I'm currently working on a collection of short stories that deal with gentrification. Here in Brooklyn, where I live, the neighborhood that I currently reside in was not the best of neighborhoods back when I first moved here in the early 90s, mid to late 90s, early 2000s. And then you slowly start to see a change. The Manhattanites were getting priced out, so they came to Brooklyn. Brooklyn neighborhoods we started to see a lot of influx of money, but the money is it's not for those who live here, it's for those who are bringing it. And the rest of us are getting pushed out. So I've been working on the most recent short story I worked on was about an old Jewish man and an MTA worker who are the last two in their apartment building. They're being pushed out, and they now have to figure out a way to stop the guys that have bought the building and are trying to force them out. And they use a particular supernatural force to do this. My last within the way station, Hell at the Way Station, I did a story called Reclaiming the Dead, which had to do with Maori Indians who are trying to reclaim shrunken heads that have been stolen from their ancestors, and how they go about the social change of the time of when they decide they want to come back and get these things plays a very huge role in it. But I would have to say I most recently started working in that vein. I really didn't do a lot of social commentary in my work. Earlier stuff was just, fun fiction, monsters and things of that nature. But I started to see there was a way to kind of intersect the two. And really it started out more of an experiment, and now it's slowly turning into something I'm going to focus on my next batch of work.
All right, and Peter.
Well, actually, I've been taking notes of all these stories I need to go find and read, but I come at it from a little different perspective. And my novels, both All Those Broken Angels and Henry Franks, dealt with bullying and that level of social commentary. But I've gotten more involved with it lately. With the novel that I currently have out on submission is a story about the deinstitutionalization of mental health back in the 70s and 80s. And it's also a treatise on euthanasia. So it deals with those subjects from an interesting perspective. But for me personally, where I do almost all my social everything is my poetry. I have 4 collections of poetry out, and in those collections, I explore everything. My novels are young adult, so I don't dip my toe too much into certain pools. My poetry is geared towards adults, and in those, I deal with racism, I deal with the Catholic Church scandals. I deal with terrorism. There is no subject so far that I have found that I won't explore through my poetry, and it's become a very successful way to explore things that have become very popular. And you know, the best example I can give you is I wrote a trilogy of poetry after Charlottesville, and those poems went really viral and went kind of around the world. And most of the success of my poetry was instigated by people finding those poems. And so I've always looked at poetry as an art form devoted to exploring anything and everything, no matter how sensitive the subject might be. Poetry needs to explore the shadows, explore the darkness, and explore the creepier things out there. And it's a way to safely explore things that I can't do in novels for teenagers.
I think my most blatant social commentary is in a book called Cold Dead Hands, which is basically the gun control book about a group of unintelligent people who are thinking, you know, guns don't kill people, people kill people, and we're gonna prove it. So they decide to set up a massacre at a grocery store, not using guns. And of course it goes horribly wrong, because sort of the point of the book is guns don't kill people, they just make it easier to kill people. And ironically, the book was, when I wrote the book, the expectation was that the government's going to come take your guns would still be a common thought instead of the president being in the pocket of the NRA. So I had to do some tweaks to the book before it was published to, unfortunately, make it a little more Trump relevant. But that's my one book. Okay, everyone kind of touched on a little. Renee touched on it specifically. I'll start with her if she has more to add. Why do you think horror is well suited to dealing with social issues? Why does this genre work particularly well with discussing that sort of thing?
Well, I feel like you can do a lot with the genre. It's first and foremost, I feel like it's a genre where you can really explore emotional experiences. So you can take people into really dark places and show them things that they might not have access to, or even be willing to look at in their day-to-day lives. So there's kind of like this ability to use the genre to sort of create a space where you can show people things that they don't normally want to look at. And that could be a monster, it could be a murder, it could be a social justice issue, it could be about conspiracy through drug companies trying to take over people's minds. I mean, you could really explore a lot of things with the genre. I recently wrote a piece for the dystopian states of America called African Twilight, that looks at not only the high number of people of color in the prison system, but it's basically a conspiracy for DNA companies and drug companies to essentially bring slavery back through the prison systems. So I don't know, I feel like it's a place where you can make people uncomfortable and in some ways force them to look at things that they wouldn't necessarily want to talk about in day-to-day life.
Excellent. All right, Marc, why do you think horror is so well suited to dealing with social issues?
Well, horror has it acts as a very fine line between reality and fantasy in and of itself. There is a line as a writer I can cross that I probably couldn't cross just being out on the street. It's a way to channel the anger and the frustration through the written word. But horror, horror has a very interesting history because it kind of acts as a bedfellow for the problems that are going on, and it's able to speak to people on a more visceral level to get them to understand the problems that are actually going on. I always think about Get Out that way, that after Get Out was basically became so popular, people began to have a conversation about it. In horror, it's horror somehow, I don't want to say desensitizes, because that's not what it does. What it invokes people to talk about it. It takes on the uncomfortability of it, and it allows people to then venture into that and have open conversations and try to discuss and work those problems out.
You know what? I'm going to skip ahead because that was what he touched on was exactly going to be my third question. So I'm just going to sort of build on that, because my question was, what can horror actually do? And I think Get Out is an excellent example. You've got the party scene at the beginning, which is packed with microaggressions. And you think of racism, you think of slavery, you think of the horse. You don't think of someone saying, a white guy walking up to a black person making a point of how much they love Obama.
Mm-hmm.
And so the scene, it's a scene of people talking, but it's uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And it definitely generates discussion. It generates wow, do I do that? Do I say, yes, I would vote Obama for a third term absolutely. And, there's also the education aspect. Lovecraft County, when the first episode came out, lots of people said, I've never heard of sundown towns.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrifying. Watchmen, the whole Tulsa massacre, many people never heard of that. I had never heard of that. I looked up, how is that possible that this isn't like a major known event in history books? So, you can blatantly, we've got recent examples where the education aspect is good. What are some other ways that, what can horror actually do? What kind of specific impact can horror have? And I'll bounce that question to who wants to answer.
I guess I'll try, since I'm apparently talking. For me, horror has a special place in the literary canon, simply because if you're writing romance or you're writing any other genre, there are limitations to your tropes that you can successfully utilize. In horror, for me, the trope is breaking the trope. It's trying to expand what has come before and to build on that. And so when I see things, we're going to use Get Out a lot, but when you make people uncomfortable and you make people realize that they might not have known this, but they've had blinders on, and horror serves to take the blinders off, because there are things going on over here that they've missed. And it's not that they've missed it on purpose. They're not doing it out of arrogance, or, they're doing it out of ignorance. And horror just lets you peek to each side, lets you peek into the shadows. It shines a light where people fear to tread. And by making people uncomfortable, it makes people think, and it makes people expand their own idea. With Watchmen, while I was fortunate in going to a high school where the Tulsa Massacre was taught, we understood that it was being taught not as part of the normal curriculum. It was outside of that. And so it's important for people to realize that there are things outside of the curriculum we're taught. And horror allows us to explore that in ways that other genres fear to tread.
Yeah, so I look at horror as a toolkit in a lot of ways, and a couple of those tools are unease and it's discomfort, and I think one of the things that horror allows us to do is, God, I normally get this question a lot, from the religious side, because people know I'm a person of faith, and they're like, well, how can you write horror, da da da, and I'm like, well, you know what, horror allows me to deal frankly with the reality of evil. and to peel back that curtain and to have that dark mirror reflect back, and allow me to display the horrific and to play with the taboos. Because let's face it, the big taboo of Get Out and of Watchmen was race. That was something that was a big taboo topic. I mean, 20 years ago, when I was writing about some of these topics, I was frozen out of publishing because it was just like, oh, no, we're not ready to talk about that. So, like, oh, okay. But you watch as the times change and the attitudes change, and doors start to open so that we are allowed to tell these stories and explore these topics. And frankly, not just the reality of evil. I think the other thing is that fear. Fear is the common language of humanity. I mean, so horror allows me to explore basically our humanness by this common element of fear. And that's one of the things I love about writing in horror. And I love the whole idea of, what can horror do? Well, right after watching, in fact, it was interesting to watch Watchmen roll out, because on Sunday when it debuts, everybody's like, oh, this Tulsa, Oklahoma, wait, what this? And then by Monday, everybody's like, wait, whoa, that was a real thing? And you watch that, and then by the end of that, and I think it was like within 6 months, Oklahoma itself, their education system said, oh, we're going to revise our curriculum so that this is now included. So I love that whole pivot point that was brought about by horror, essentially. And the other thing I'll use would be, actually, I'll get away from Get Out, and I'll use Beloved by Toni Morrison, which many people don't even consider. And it's interesting how many people don't even consider that a horror novel, but when they discuss it as a horror novel. Because I used to get in all these arguments all the time about Beloved, and I'd hear some of my horror compatriots say, well, that's not a horror novel. Well, why isn't it? Well, I mean, because that book was just too disturbing and it felt real. And I'm like, that is like literally the definition of what we want to do with horror. We want to disturb you, but what was disturbing to them was the thing they did not want to confront, which I found really interesting. The reality of slavery and the legacy of slavery and the legacy of hatred and racism was so disturbing for them. It was easier for them to not consider it a horror novel than to wrestle with the elements that the novel brought to bear.
I want to touch on something Maurice said, because I am too a man of faith, but I love to mix religion and horror, and I've learned so much through that channel. There was some years ago, there was a film called Stigmata that dealt with first of all, I didn't know what a stigmata was, which is basically when you start bleeding from the hands and the feet, which were the symbols of Christ. But then I found out about all of the books that had been, the Gospels that had been removed and had been locked away because there were certain sections of the church that were afraid that if people could decipher it, they would not, I guess the church's idea was money and faith go hand in hand, when in actuality, what it was trying to teach was that you didn't need a building in order to have faith. And, the education from that allowed me to open up and write so many other different things using religion. So yeah, I completely agree with that.
Oh, okay. So can I bounce something off of that?
Yeah.
So the thing that taught me how to blend my faith with my writing the most, it comes from the other direction. It was reading Stephen King. Because he had a novel called Desperation, and the whole theme of the novel was you're either in a state of faith or you're in a state of desperation. That's literally the theme of the book.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there trying to figure out because I was wrestling with the whole idea of how do I involve my faith in my horror writing, and then Stephen King's like, well, here's how you do it. And so I learned a lot about even wrestling with my own faith. When we talk about the power of horror, ironically, wrestling with my faith and growing in my faith through reading Stephen King.
Other comments?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the fact that people thought that Toni Morrison's book was not a horror novel. And I honestly, when I read it, probably for the third time, it occurred to me that I was reading, and this is probably not a real genre, but I was reading Southern Black Gothic. And I kept thinking about that over and over and over, and I kept thinking, are there more books like this? And yeah, I'm sure that there are. But then that also made me think about something recently. A friend of mine from high school was talking to me about, we were talking about Lovecraft Country, and she made a statement that gave me pause. And her statement was, I love this new genre of Black horror. And I was like, that's not a new genre. I mean, I didn't know what to say in the moment because it kind of floored me a little bit. But Black people have been writing horror for a really long time. Or, you know, what's that quote from Tenerife Do about Black history is Black horror? I mean, so for someone to say to me this new genre of Black horror, I really had to think about that. Like, we need to fix that. That's not true. It's not new.
Well,
Anyway.
even that the idea of the how would you put the southern Black Gothic?
Southern Black Gothic.
Because I that's exactly the category I would put a movie like East Bayou into.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Other comments? All right. So I actually, a while ago, I was at there was a film series, and you would watch a movie and you would discuss the social commentary involved. And the moderator made the comment that he thought pretty much all horror was social commentary to some extent. And someone in the audience said, well, that's not true. There's no social commentary in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And he's like, oh, no, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is packed with social commentary. But it's possible to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and get nothing out of it except Leatherface going after people with a chainsaw. So, you know, it varies. You know, Get Out, it's on the surface. You know what Get Out's about. You know, there's multiple levels of depth to it, but you don't walk out of Get Out thinking, well, that was just a superficial horror film. Whereas, like, the original Dawn of the Dead, that's a satire of consumerism. You can watch that whole movie and just think, oh, it's zombies. And George Romero purposely, you know, did not get too blatant with it. The original Night of the Living Dead had the first time a Black man had been the star of a horror movie. Dwayne Jones wanted them to make an issue of that, and George Romero, no, you just play it like anyone else. We're going to be cool and not make a big deal out of it. So they're two very different options. Do you think that there's a advantage to subtext versus coming out and saying it? Does it matter either way? What works do you think have done a particularly good job with either approach? Again, anyone can start. We are out of the taking your turn portion of the panel. Or how do you do it in your own work? Do you start with does it come out as subtext, or do you specifically say, this is what I'm going to write about?
Some of my stuff, it comes out as the story is evolving. There'll be a character in there that I'm not focused on, and will say something as I'm working. I'll go, oh great, now I'm gonna have to follow you down this rabbit hole and see where you're taking me. That's where I write some of my best work, when it's the character that decides, listen, we need to discuss X, Y, and Z in the room, and then I can veer off into that. I personally don't like being beaten over the head with social commentary and horror, because then it doesn't feel organic. Case in point, I was talking to somebody, I love anthology films, and Tales from the Hood many years ago, each story it was just one after the other, just getting knocked over the head with, you know, nothing was subtle. You didn't get an opportunity to meld with the stories, much like you would with, like, say, the Twilight Zone, where, you know, it's a rare, but you'll find something within it. So I think it's always good when it's, well, for me, I would say I like it when it's just under the surface, and I can have that oh wow moment rather than just being knocked over the head with it.
Other comments on subtext?
I'd agree with Mark in that subtlety is very helpful. When I'm writing poetry, I'm specifically choosing a topic, and so the subtlety is not there to the extent that a novel can play with. With the novel that I have out on submission now, it started out as a haunted house story, and it was going to be a very simple, very, very easy haunted house story that I was going to write. And then I realized that I had a lot of people who were being killed who were terminal. And I suddenly started realizing that I had a lot of euthanasia subtext. And then I realized that there's a lot of that, the mental health crisis and the way that people were declared sane in the mid 70s, and the government said, we're shutting down all the asylums. You're sane. Goodbye. Here's your suit. And that was it. They weren't given any follow-up treatment. They were treated as non-entities. And within milliseconds, you had a homeless crisis. And it was like, well, there's a reason for that. And so I'm writing this haunted house story, and it suddenly, the characters are starting to talk to me and say, no, there's some levels here that you need to explore. And that exploration took almost a year for this little short haunted house story that I thought was going to take, 4 or 5 months to write. It ended up being something far grander and hopefully far better, and hopefully it will sell. And that's what, the goal is really meaningful subtext. But if someone just wants to read it as a haunted house story, they're welcome to. But hopefully they'll get more out of it than that. And again, going back to Get Out, there were parts, it hits you over the head, but it gets inside your head. And that's the power of it, is that it gets inside and it doesn't go away. So there are benefits there are benefits to both, that, consumerism down here and zombies up here, but it works. If done well, either will work.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I was going with it, because I'm about as subtle as an episode of Star Trek. I'll just put it that way. And so, and I think part of that is because whenever I sit down to write a story, I'm writing from a place of, what is pressing on my heart right now. So I'm leading with what's pressing on my heart and what's occupying my thoughts. And so, and I recognize, 20 years in, I recognize that this is what I do. So for me, the name of the game is, all right, so you know what? Yes, we're starting at this point. Now, can I tell such an interesting story that even though you feel like I might be hitting you over the head with something, I'm going to entertain you along the way. I'm going to wrap you in the spell of the story and carry you along, either by plot or by character or by dialogue or any of the other tools we have at our disposal. I'm going to wrap you up and carry you along, so that, yes, I like the way you put it, so that my story gets in you, despite despite me hitting you over the head. So.
The comments on subtext before we move on? Okay, so we've discussed Get Out as an example of it done extremely well. Beloved, Lovecraft Country. Are there other examples of it done, of horror as social commentary, whether books, movies, TV shows, any type of media done particularly well, or going to Mark's comment on Tales from the Hood, done badly? What are some of your favorites or least favorites?
I guess one of my favorites would be Victor Laval, the Ballad of Black Tom.
Ballad of Black Tom.
Yeah, I was afraid I was going to slip.
Yeah.
Look here, I jumped in first. I knew someone was going to tell you, so I there.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons why it's such a masterstroke is, okay, yes, that one actually is a subtle work. even though Victor kind of, calls a shot early on, and it's coming as a sort of commentary on Lovecraft and racism. But again, he does such a masterful job of like, I will take you to the edge. You think it's coming? No, it's not coming yet. I'm gonna take you to the edge again. Nope, it's not coming yet. And again, I think it comes back to that whole, a writer's ability to bring someone along for the ride. But yeah, Ballad of Black Tom would be my nominee for one of the ways to get a well done way of doing that.
Other choices? I will say I loved the movie The Hunt as a fun horror hunting humans type movie, but the blatant political satire was awful. It was both sides, which is fine. It's like, we're going to make fun of the liberals and we're going to make fun of the conservatives. But it was so heavy-handed, and it was basically just the conservative characters would shout off the buzzwords, and then the liberal characters would shout off the buzzwords. And it was, a fantastic action adventure horror movie, but the political satire was just, I thought, embarrassing. It was like, I would just cringe at that point. So I thought that was done particularly poorly.
Well, anything that comes out of Trauma Studios I had an opportunity to talk to Lloyd Kaufman once, and I literally was like, when I first saw those films when I was a teenager, I was like, I completely missed whatever it was you were trying to say in all of that work. And later on, when he explains it, and then you go back and you look at it, if you can get past the bad acting and just the overflow of gore for no apparent reason, you do find it's like, oh, okay, I see what you were trying to say. I just had to get through all of this other stuff first. But actually, interestingly enough, Eli Roth's The Green Inferno, which was a social commentary on deforestation, although he was actually trying to play homage to the cannibal films of the early 80s. This particular one, I kind of like this version a little bit better, in terms of they were going someplace to help, and then the people there, because of everything going around them, decided to take out their frustrations on these poor people who had nothing to do with what was going on really with the deforestation of the jungle, as opposed to the early 80s work where it was just misogynistic, just gory for no reason, just how far we can push the boundaries in a film rather than just, tell a story.
It's an interesting tangent off of that, is that in young adult horror over the past 10 years or so, there has been a subgenre of environmental disaster. And the overwhelming majority of them read like press releases by PR firms representing environmental groups. And they can be borderline unreadable because it's so blatantly, I mean, I almost want to use the word pedantic. It just hits you over the head with this giant green mallet. And that's not how you persuade anyone, and that's not how you entice anyone to agree with you. There are books out there that are so well written that you finish them, and only then do you realize that you have been converted to something. And that's a great thing. But there's literally hundreds of this in these books that they're difficult to read because they don't understand that entertaining and casting that magic spell comes first. Because if you don't do that, you've lost the reader, and once you lose the reader, they're not going to stick around to get your point.
Over the weekend, I finally had a chance to watch Gretel and Hansel. And initially, I was interested in it because it has a really scary witch in it, and that was something I was super excited about. Plus, it's based on a fairy tale that we're all familiar with, and fairy tales, much like horror, are a great way for you to help people see the darker parts of society and culture. And what was really interesting to me is, even though in some ways they're kind of hitting you over the head with this darkness, this presumed evilness of the witch, there was a subtext of female empowerment that was not hitting you over the head. So it's a very feminist look at an old story, where essentially, I believe, at least previously, we were meant to hate the witch and see her as taking away the agency of the children by eating them. But in this telling, this girl, Gretel, who has basically the weight of the world on her, she is responsible for her brother. They're lost in the woods because her mother has cast them out, so they're homeless also. And she has to figure out how she's going to take care of him. And this older woman tells her she has a choice, that she doesn't have to become the problem solver of everything. She does not have to become responsible for this brother. She has a choice. She can have her own agency and do her own thing. So it was kind of amazing that I wanted to watch it because it's based on one of my favorite fairy tales. It deals with cannibalism, it deals with witches, it's really cool. And I walked away feeling this really weird sense of empowerment that, you're right, I don't have to be the things that everyone else tells me I have to be. I can be my own thing. And so, I don't know, I thought that was kind of amazing.
And I would say fairy tales fall under horror.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They should anyway. Yeah. If they're good, they do.
Mm-hmm.
Other examples?
Michelle, have you ever seen Ginger Snaps?
Oh my gosh, yeah, those are some of my favorite movies.
That, as soon as you started talking about the witch, I remember watching that, and the first time I was like, is this an interesting werewolf story? And then, but as a guy, now I start to see, like, as the layers are getting pulled back, I'm like, oh, that's not what this is about at all. This is a really cool way of going about telling that story. That's absolutely awesome way of social commentary for that. Yeah.
Yeah, those are really great. I love those movies.
Yeah.
Other examples of it done particularly well or not well? All right. Well, normally this would be the part where, as moderator, I would turn to the audience and say, hey, what questions do you have? We don't have an audience, so I'll throw that out to the panelists. Do you have any questions you would like for the other panelists or to answer yourself? Anything we haven't, we've got about 10 more minutes left. Anything you would like to discuss that we haven't covered yet?
This is one of those things you should have prepared us for.
No, this is supposed to be the easy part. This is supposed to be, oh, I've been waiting to make this point the whole time and he never asked the right question.
Whenever I do one of these, I always feel like I haven't seen enough. I haven't read enough. There's the to be read pile and the to be watched pile are so enormous. And now I'm just adding to it. And I'm just like, I don't have enough time to get to, and, forgive my ignorance, but Ginger Snaps, that's completely new to me. And
Ginger Snaps is awesome.
Those. And so I'm like, oh my God, there's more than one. I'm like, so I'm always curious if you were to be talking to someone and they were to ask, what are the books or movies that you must read or watch? What would those be? That's another question I should have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that it's a must watch at all. I just did a podcast. It just went live today, which won't be live for the people watching this, but for us, the 5 of us in this room, it went live today. And it's a podcast called The Necronomicon, and it takes a horror movie and does a deep dive into the social commentary. And a lot of the, Get Out had obviously already been taken by the time they got to me, and a lot of the more blatant ones, but I did a, hour-and-a-half deep dive into Return of the Living Dead, the social issues in that. And that was
Wow.
a lot of fun. That was sort of like, how you think it should be punks, bad guys, and then normal people, but it's not, it's mixed. You've got good and bad on both sides. If you have, when you're required to spend an hour-and-a-half talking about Return of the Living Dead, it's amazing how much social commentary stuff you can come up with. And I think probably if you were just randomly assigned any horror movie and said, all right, we're going to get on the phone and be ready, I think you could, most horror movies, you can, even Friday the 13th, you could probably come up with, there's a lot of not necessarily blatant depth to it. You don't walk out of Friday the 13th thinking, wow, I think about the world in a whole new way now. But I think social commentary is very firmly embedded in the genre. And I think most movies or books, if you really do the deep dive, you can find a lot of stuff there.
There is one thing I have noticed. It appears there's a trope that's slowly dying out, and it has to do with the black guy not making it to the end of the movie anymore. And I've been noticing a lot of those films because that used to be the thing we used to always laugh about. It's like we go to the movies when I was young. We start and we're like, okay, how long till he gets it? Because he's not going to make it to the end of the film. And now we're either the hero of the story or we're saving someone and we're making it to the end. I mean, this was before Get Out, actually. There's one film in particular that I'm still a little angry about, but I appreciate what they did, which was called Virus, which was a group of scientists who find this derelict ship, and the ship is overrun by an alien life form that uses machines to rebuild itself. And at the beginning of the film, there's one black guy with the crew, and he freaks out, and he's like, that's it, I'm out of here. And he disappears for the whole film. And then he pops up again building, we don't know what he's building, but all he says is, I went to MIT. I don't need to die on this ship like this. And it turned out he built like a rocket sled to get off the boat. And I'm like, well, there we go. I was so pleased to see that. I mean, unfortunately, he was not one of the many that made it, but it was appreciated that, he wasn't some, the guy that freaks out and panics and running all over the place and just getting in everybody's way. He actually applied science to trying to get out of it. So, I'm noticing that's changing.
Well, I think that trend goes back to, what were those movies? Anaconda, and then, what was the one with the shark that had LL Cool J in it?
Deep Blue Sea.
Right. And so, because like a lot of the hip hop artists, when they started doing those movies, had it written into their contract, I don't die in this movie.
So they kill Sam Jackson instead. Right,
exactly.
To be fair, that was the greatest exit of any character in horror movies.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting pretty close to the end. Are there any final thoughts? Anything you wanted to cover that we didn't? Anything where we're going to log out and you're like, oh, no, that's what I was going to say.
I'm still agonizing over what are the must-see movies I would recommend. That's
Right.
That's when this is over, like I'll probably have to go to the Discord with my list. That's what.
Well, because people can click on the links and get the bios of everyone who's here, but we're still going to end this panel by going down the line and just tell people where they can find you online. And we'll start with, I'll go by what I'm seeing on my screen, so we'll start with Peter.
Well, obviously, you know, Amazon, I can, you know, most of my books are available on barnesandnoble.com and everywhere else. I have a website, peteradamsolomon.com, and I've got 4 novels and 4 books of poetry and 1 short story collection that are currently out for sale. So please feel free to follow me along.
All right, Michelle?
Unfortunately, I'm on social media way more than I should be. So you can usually find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram actually is my favorite. But I also have a website, Girl Meets Monster, and I do a lot of interviewing of other writers. Every Friday I do fiction fragments, and I've got some pretty cool guests coming up in the next couple of months. So you should totally check it out.
Excellent. Maurice?
So I'm a branding specialist. So it's mauricebroaddus.com. And if you want to find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, it's Maurice Broaddus. I have I think a dozen books out, nearly 100 short stories published. My collection, The Voices of Martyrs, and I think my next project out will actually be a middle grade book. So I just had a middle grade book come out not too long ago, The Usual Suspects, and my next one, Unfadable, is my next book out, coming out in the spring.
Excellent. And Marc?
Okay, you can find me at whoismarclabbott.com. That's my website. That's where all of my books, short films, and short stories are. You can find me on Facebook, Who is Marc L. Abbott. That's the same handle on Twitter. And yeah, that's pretty much where you can find me if you're looking.
All right. Thank you to all our guests. Thank you for tuning into Horror as a Social Platform. If you've enjoyed this panel, please be sure to check out Multiverse's other programming this weekend. The full schedule is available on multiversecon.org. Thank you very much.